By definition, that's what it was. And another interesting point is that when I said in the debate, if Israel were a democracy, it would be called Palestine. I'm alluding to this origin of the conflict because the Arabs at the time after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the British occupied Palestine. Well, the Arabs were demanding recognition of Palestine's independence, which they had been promised. The Arabs supported the war effort based on the promise that Britain was going to support the independence of Arab territories from Ottoman rule, from Turkish rule. And of course, they reneged on that promise when it came to the Arabs of Palestine, Arab Palestinians. And so democracy was fine as long as Jews were a majority. And so as long as Jews weren't the majority, they were going to deny any form of democratic government to the people of Palestine. So that was the nature of the occupation. This specific purpose of Britain's belligerent occupation of Palestine was to deny the Palestinians their right to self-determination. It was the whole purpose of the occupation, so that the British would facilitate the Zionist project, the Zionist settler colonial project.
See, I think that because I wanted to ask you also about the 1920, 1929, those events, because in some ways I hate to do it because everybody's done atrocities, and certainly Israel doesn't want to do a body count on this, but everybody, on both sides have done terrible things to each other, and so it turns into a Hatfield McCoy thing, and so I almost hate that kind of argument, although that's the nature of it. Like, it is a violent, terrible thing that's going on even to today. But so, you know, in order to understand that, we have to understand what happened in 1920, because sounds. Eli made it sound like, and I've heard it all my life, that the Arabs just didn't like the Jews. They didn't like that they were taking over their land, and so they rose up and it was violent because of racism. Um, so is that what happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, the British, after every one of those outbreaks of violence, had commissions of inquiry, looking at the question of what was the cause, like why did Arabs react this way? Why was there this outbreak of violence? And they very convincingly argued that it wasn't due to any kind of inherent anti-Semitism. In fact, they pointed out things like that Arab leaders expressed a willingness to to help to absorb Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, provided that Western countries like the U.S. and Britain also did their share to absorb refugees. So it was very clear that it wasn't an issue of, although certainly there is, I'm not denying that there is anti-Semitism, and at the time among Arabs, but it wasn't a characteristic of the Palestinians. It wasn't a character trait, and they pointed out that before the Zionist movement, Jews and Arabs in Palestine, had friendly relations. It wasn't until the Zionist movement that you started seeing these outbreaks of violence. And the British pointed this out, that it was because it wasn't inherent anti-Semitism. It was the growing fears the growing recognition, number one, of how their promise of independence had been denied and reneged by the British, and how the British had betrayed them in order to essentially to facilitate the Zionist project to reconstitute Arab Palestine, into a demographically Jewish state. Their realization that they were being deprived of their rights, including their right to self-determination, led to growing fears and frustrations among the Arab population, understandably. Which isn't to say that the attacks were justified, of course, but it's one thing to understand. To understand is not to justify.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean there's not a reason, you know.
Right. And so that's what we need to, not to justify, but to understand, and to, what were the real reasons for it. And the British did a really, you read their reports, and they're very persuasive in arguing against the idea that it was just, expressions of anti-Semitism.
Right. Okay. Um, okay, so that kind of brings me to another point that Eli made that I think you can see is maybe legitimate, which is, well, um, you know, hundreds of thousands of millions of Jews have been, um, uh, kicked out of Arab lands, kicked out of Europe, kicked out of Asia, um, kicked out of a lot of places for anti-Semitic reasons, and that they need a homeland, a specific Jewish run, controlled homeland for the survival of their people.
Hmm.
Um, and that it's okay then for them to have, for example, I think the argument of why they have such laws against um, or maybe in favor of Jews in Israel is because they need that in order to maintain their people. Um, and is that not a legitimate concern that if um, you know if Israel were to go away, or if if they conceded in any way, not only would Israel be wiped off the map, but potentially genocide on their part.
Yeah, you could refer to expulsions of Jews from Arab states, both before and after 1948, and also, the Holocaust is always cited as kind of a justification for, the Jews need a state of their own. But the problem with that argument is that the Palestinians weren't responsible for any of those crimes against Jews. So why should they be made to pay the price for them? Why should the Palestinians have been made to pay the cost for the Holocaust, with their rights being systematically violated, with their right to self-determination being denied? It just is completely inequitable and unjust to treat the Palestinians that way due to the crimes of Arab states or European countries against Jews, for which Palestinians bore no responsibility whatsoever. So that's the problem with the argument. It's yeah, sure. There was a lot of prejudice against Jews and crimes against Jews and violation of Jews' rights, including genocide in Europe. Um, but that doesn't justify crimes against the Palestinians and violation of Palestinians' rights. And so that's the problem with the argument. It is prejudicial against Palestinians' rights.
I think so. So I know that the topic of the debate was what's the root cause of the conflict, which I think is important to get to. Um, but I also think that, and we talked about it before, but I want to press this point because I think it's maybe the most emotional, and the maybe the best argument for how Israel's handling things today, and that is the perception. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the perception that um, anytime the heavy hand of Israel is lightened, you have suicide bombers, you have rockets, you have Israel under attack